Primary data is also called raw data, and every research or project needs data or information to help it answer specific questions, validate hypotheses, or attain objectives. And primary data is a source of an original data source, that is one in which the data are collected firsthand by the researcher for a specific research purpose or project. There are several sources of primary data, and these sources actually provide first-hand evidence about an event, an object, person, or a work of art. And primary sources of data include, and are not limited to, maybe historical and legal documents, eyewitness accounts, results of experiments, statistical data, pieces of creative writing, audio and video recordings which can be transcribed and analyzed. Those are sources of primary data. Speeches and art objects, interviews, surveys, fieldwork, and internet communications, like internet, what we read on certain blogs, or maybe videos from vloggers. Those are primary sources of information. In the natural and social sciences, its primary sources are often from often form the basis of empirical studies. And this is research where an experiment was performed or a direct observation was made. And the results of such empirical studies are eventually what we find published in scholarly articles and papers that are delivered at conferences. But notice that when these papers finally are published and maybe archived in libraries, they become secondary sources of data. So from a primary source of data which has been processed and reported in a document, or maybe out of which a scholarly article has been published, that article is a secondary source, but originally it came from primary data. There are several sources of primary data, and it could be emails, it could be from email communications, it could be from advertising online, it could be from videos, photos, infographics, social media groups, pages, profiles, websites, blogs, forums, comments that people leave on chats, online under videos. It could be responses that were generated from online surveys like the one that we had in class. These are all sources of primary data, and even more. It's important to note that observational data is also a form of primary data, and observational data is a valuable form of research that can give researchers information that goes beyond numbers and statistics. One mistake that people make sometimes is often to think that statistics, tables, graphs, statistics, numbers are only the sources of data or information that we can interpret. But that is a limited way of looking at it, because in society, observational data is also primary data that is very useful and can back our arguments or our claims, and that's a scientific method. In general, observation is a systematic way to collect data by observing people in natural situations or settings. There are many different types of observation, and each one has its weaknesses and its strengths, as we are going to see. One form of observation is what we call participant observation. And participant observation is when a researcher is involved in the activity they are observing. For example, the researcher is a participant in an Alcoholics Anonymous group. Let's just take this as an example. And they are observing something about that group. So in digital marketing, a good example is joining a Facebook group that is built around a particular niche and following up the conversations that people are making and participating in these conversations in order to understand a phenomenon that is being investigated. So at this point, you are joining that Facebook group as a participant. And this kind of research, if you look at it, is very constructivist in nature, because the epistemology assumes that the researcher is part of the research, and at the end of the day, their analysis of the events will probably be shaped by their experience within that group that they were observing. Non-participant observation, on the other hand, is the kind of observation in which the researcher is separate from the activity that they are observing. And this is what positivists think is their epistemology, which means that the researcher can observe a phenomenon in the real world without that phenomenon impacting them and without their own preconceived notion impacting what they are observing. So at that point, the participant is distant to the phenomenon being investigated and they only observe at a distance. But at the end of the day, be it participant or non-participant observation, both approaches actually are ways of generating primary data. Another important way of collecting primary data in the sphere of marketing is through consumer panels. And a consumer panel is a group of individuals selected by a business or an organization to provide input and opinion on products and services for research on consumer behavior. Panel members are chosen to represent to be representative of the general population or target group. So if, for example, we took the students in this class to represent the college and we are trying to get their opinion about the experience in the college, and let's say 50 students participated in that interview, at the end of the day we can generalize their opinions as reflecting what the general population is experiencing in that college, based on which we can come up with recommendations. Another useful instrument and approach to collecting primary data is using questionnaires. And a questionnaire is a research instrument consisting of a series of questions for the purpose of gathering information from respondents. The questionnaire was first invented in London in 1838. We probably have seen what questionnaires look like, and we have probably participated in some study in which questionnaires were used, maybe online or offline. But questionnaires may look a bit like what we have on the screen, with maybe multiple choice type questions and options where participants are asked to select something that they feel about a product or a service. We could also have scales on a questionnaire. We could also have open-ended questions where you are asked to write out your opinion. So there are different forms of questions on a questionnaire which you'll be seeing subsequently. But questionnaires will look a bit like what you have on your screen. One important thing you should know about questionnaires is that they have different types of questions that you can ask. We have multiple choice questions. We have questions that are based on a scale. How likely are you to recommend this product? Very likely could be 5 points, and very unlikely could be 0. So within that range, respondents can choose what they feel about that product. We also have rating scales. We have a scale that is commonly used in social science research. It's called a Likert scale. And then we have open-ended questions where respondents have the flexibility to write out their feeling about a specific question that was asked, or about a phenomenon or an event that is being investigated. But for questionnaires to serve as effective tools for collecting primary data, you need to have some good practices in mind. Like, for example, keeping the questionnaire brief. Most questionnaires don't need to be longer than 1 page. So if you have a questionnaire that has so many questions and you're trying to convince people to fill out your questionnaire, there's a chance that very long questionnaires will go unanswered, and at the end of the day your objectives will not be attained if people don't respond to your questionnaire. So keeping a questionnaire brief is a good practice. Also, one other good practice is to choose a good visual design. Choose the right fonts, make it easy for people to read the text that are on your questionnaire. And one suggestion is to use maybe the fonts Arial or Helvetica, which are easy to read. Keep the text size also big enough, so when giving your questionnaire, even if people are impatient, don't add the impatience by using fonts that are not clear enough on the right or the wrong color combination maybe on your questionnaire. So keep it visually appealing to whoever is filling it out. Another good practice when creating questionnaires is to use a clear research process. Before even beginning to plan questions for your questionnaire, you should ensure you have a definite direction for it. A questionnaire is only effective if its question brings in results that help you to answer an overarching research question. So keep it clear, let the research process be clear, and let the questions that you seek to respond with those questionnaires align perfectly. Another good practice when creating questionnaires is to create questionnaires with straightforward, unbiased language. when you're crafting your questions, it's important that you get your point across very well, and you don't want that there be any confusion for customers, because these may wrongly influence their answers. So if you ask questions in a biased manner, or if you ask questions in a fashion that is not straightforward and people don't understand where you're going to with the question, they will end up providing maybe incorrect responses, or responses that don't answer the anticipated question. So keep it straightforward, keep it used on biased language. Another good practice is to ensure that every question you put on your questionnaire is important. A while ago, we were talking about keeping the questionnaire simple, keeping it straightforward, keeping it short. But if you put in questions that are not important, it's going to make it long. People will get tired of filling a very long questionnaire. So questions that are irrelevant, are not important in responding to the overarching question that the researcher is seeking to investigate, should be kept out of the questionnaire. So keep this in mind when designing your questionnaire. Another thing to have in mind is to ask one question at a time. Since every question has a purpose, each one should be asked one at a time. This lets the customer to focus and encourages them to provide a thoughtful response. This is particularly important for open-ended questions where customers need to describe an experience or an opinion. So ask one question at a time. Don't ask two questions and get things mixed up. You may end up missing getting the right answer, or maybe you have the question answered in part and not in full. So always keep one question at a time, especially for open-ended questions. Another thing to keep in mind is to order your questions logically. A good questionnaire is like a good book. The beginning questions should lay the framework, the middle ones should cut to the core issues, and the final questions should tie all of the loose ends up. This type of sensible flow keeps customers engaged throughout the entire survey. Sometimes you should ask questions in a way that there is some logic. The first question should kind of maybe even reinforce understanding of the second, and the third one is kind of summing things up. Don't ask maybe the first question in the place of the third question, or the third question coming first. All of that could also confuse even the respondents and will not go benefit you very well in the end. So order your questions with some logic at the back of your mind. Another thing that is important is also to consider your target audience. Whenever you collect customer feedback, you need to keep in mind the goals and needs of your target audience. After all, the participants in this questionnaire are your active customers. Your questions should be geared towards the interests and experiences they have had with your company. Another thing when we talk about considering the right target audience is the fact too that the tone and style in which you write your questionnaire can also not appeal to a certain kind of audience. So whenever you create your audience, your questionnaire, you should think about your audience. So let's just assume we were interviewing people of, let's say, a very young age group who cannot read and understand certain words which may be too advanced for them. You have to consider that, or maybe they have a low level of education or a very high level of education. You have to consider all these elements when creating a questionnaire. So the target audience is also very important. One key step, which is also a good practice when you work with questionnaires, is that when you create your questionnaire, you want to test it first on a small sample size before sending out the questionnaire to the mass public, to see how people respond to your questionnaire and see if it's effective and well structured. If you had maybe plans of sending out a questionnaire to 10,000 people, you don't want to send out a questionnaire to 10,000 people just to realize there was a mistake somewhere and it ends up confusing the respondents. You want to test maybe with a sample of 100 people before seeing how the questionnaire is, if the responses and everything align perfectly, before you send it out to the 10,000 people that you anticipate. Because having it wrong, getting it wrong, sometimes it's hard to convince people again to fill a questionnaire a second time. So you have to think about this carefully. So we have talked about the different kinds of questions that you will find on a questionnaire. So this is a sample of a customer, like the kind of questionnaires we will issue maybe to customer to test customer satisfaction. And these are questions that we could probably ask. For example, how likely are you to recommend us to family, friends, or colleagues? And you see the extremely likely, somewhat extremely unlikely, somewhat unlikely, neutral, somewhat likely, extremely likely. These are some kind of scales that we could use to test their level of satisfaction. How satisfied were you with your experience with us? And we have a scale from 1 to 10. On a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied were you with us? Who did you purchase these products for? Yourself, your family, your friends, your colleagues, so on and so forth. These are like multiple choice type of questions. And if you look at question 7, how can we improve your experience for the future? That's an open-ended question. So it requires the respondent to write out a bit, maybe a few sentences to explain what the experience with your product was. But what I'm saying here is that it's an example of an open-ended question. Question 6 is a true or false type of a question, a yes or no kind of question. So questionnaires sometimes have a variety of question structures, a bit like what we have here. One thing that this slide is trying to say is showing you that interviews and transcriptions are also other important sources of primary data. So we have looked at questionnaires as instruments of collecting primary data, but these are other ways of collecting primary data. You can go out to the field and actually interview people about the phenomenon you are investigating. And when you interview these people, maybe you are recording it on a device. When you get home and you have interviewed, for example, let's say you interviewed 10 people, the next thing you want to do is to transcribe all of what they said. So, and transcription is just like a word-for-word writing of the text of all of what was said in an audio. So bringing it from audio form, recorded form, to text form is what we call transcription. So when you transcribe text that came from audios like this, you can then proceed with other methods of data interpretation which find themselves within the realm of qualitative analysis. And part of it we saw in the previous lessons was about coding qualitative data, where you identify preliminary codes and final codes. That is how you proceed by interpreting. We also saw the hermeneutic cycle. Hermeneutics is a strategy that we can also use when interpreting primary data which came in through open-ended questions, for example. And if we went out with interviews, usually these are like a form of open-ended questions that you ask people's opinion about different phenomena under investigation. So when they give you your opinion and you transcribe, you can then proceed with codification and qualitative data analysis methods and techniques, where we start with primary codes or preliminary codes and then final codes. As digital marketing students, you'll be graduating maybe 1 year from now, and you will be going to the field where you will be confronted with situations where you have to use a questionnaire to understand maybe the competitors in the business. You will have to interview a lot of people to do market research with regards to competitors of a business. You may be boarding clients. So maybe you have a digital marketing agency, they want to consult with a client for, or provide services to a client for SEO, PPC, maybe web development, any other service that is related to digital marketing. At that point, sometimes you need to use a questionnaire to collect as much information from these small business owners as possible, so that you can use that to structure your digital marketing campaigns. So there are several applications of primary data sources. There are many ways we can collect them, but there are also many ways we can interpret them, leverage them to align our strategies with our objectives, and maybe achieve a very good, a successful campaign for a client. So at this stage, we have come to the end of this slide, and it's up to you to start thinking about some innovative ways you can use qualitative data in your business strategy, in your digital marketing strategy. Thanks for listening up to this end, and that was it for this 4th class on primary data sources and questionnaires.